Hi, everybody. As I mentioned before, my name is Sean, and I am the team lead for the voter engagement project. Um, Welcome to our presentation about our project and what we've worked on so far this semester. So, as I mentioned earlier, my name is Sean, and I am the team lead for this project. I'm a third-year mechanical engineering major.
Hi, my name is Asim. I'm a first-year advertising major.
Hi, I'm Gwen. I'm a second year business major.
Hello, I'm Jonathan, and I'm a first-year computer science major.
Hi, my name is Sahana, and I'm a second year advertising major.
Hello again. My name is Corey, and I'm a third-year MIS major.
And our project mentor for this project is Jared Culp. I'm not sure if he was able to make it today, but many thanks to him and his guidance. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So we just had our team introductions. I think next we'll go into some of the design thinking process and where we are in terms of that. Then we'll talk about some statistics and some outside research that we did prior to going into the project. And next we'll talk about some themes that we got from doing our research. Next we'll talk about some user personas that we came up with from those themes. And finally, we'll talk about the next steps for our project. So the design thinking process, if you're not aware, the design thinking process is a human-centered framework for design. It's basically a framework for us to design around our users and really empathize and come up with a solution centered around them. In terms of the process, we are at the tail end of the define phase, and we are about to go into ideation. That would be our next step. And then after that, we would have prototyping and finally user testing.
So in defining our problem, the first step that we did was doing some preliminary research on the subject of voter engagement. So we found a few key statistics on the subject. And just as an aside, this graphic that we have displayed does not have 2020 results because the election results have not been completely finalized yet. But some of the key statistics we found were that younger voters, shown in red, tend to vote at much lower rates than other age groups. We also found that turnout is cyclical and is usually only concentrated towards national presidential elections. And lastly, we found that Texas is ranked near the bottom at 45 out of 50 in the United States in terms of voter turnout. So with this in mind, we came up with 3 key takeaways on how we should focus our project. And we decided to focus on voter engagement among younger voters in Texas and particularly in local elections. So with that, we came up with a sort of problem statement or goal that we would try to focus on throughout the semester. And this is, how might we improve voter engagement in local politics among Texans aged 18 to 22? So then we went into doing some of our own research out in the field, and we were able to get 97 survey responses, 8 user interviews, and through our research, we were able to identify 4 general overarching themes. So in our survey, we asked respondents about their general perceptions on local politics, voting, the registration process, and just their overall political knowledge. And some key trends we found that Texas college students tend to think that local elections are very important, and they rated their perceived importance of local elections at a 7.9 out of 10 on average. But despite thinking that local elections are important, most respondents rated their familiarity with local candidates at just a 3.9 out of 10. And in fact, only 6% of our survey respondents actually knew the role of the lieutenant governor in Texas. So in trying to find the reasoning behind this discrepancy, we were not able to find many physical barriers towards access to voting, as 90% of our respondents described that they had the means necessary to vote at their nearest polling location.
So based on the results from our survey and research, as well as our interviews that Jonathan mentioned earlier, we have noticed 4 common themes among our users. And so the first theme is election motivation. The second one is media biases. The third one is pandemic problems, and lastly, political decisions. So diving deeper into our first theme, which is election motivation, we've noticed that many of our interviewees have a hard time accessing local news. And so, for example, one of the interviewees said that I always see ads on TV for presidential elections, but none for local elections. And the second theme that we found is media biases. And we noticed that people have a difficult time in finding neutral sources of information. And now this might be either because of the way that news sources portray certain information, or based on what one of our interviewers said is that I believe local elections have more impact on voters' daily life, but I only hear from the propositions that are well funded and have money to campaign. And I'm moving on to a third theme.
Yeah. So, as a lot of people probably know, that right now there's a pandemic going on, and as this happens, it affects a lot of the ways we do our normal daily lives as well as voting. And so, because of the pandemic, many people now prioritize convenience in registration and voting. One of those ways of convenience is online registration or online voting in some states. And one of our quotes was, "I registered online to vote. Online registration was more accessible and easier." Another way people combated this pandemic problem was through a lot of early voting, which a lot of our interviewees did as well. The last theme that we have is from political decisions, especially political decisions based on their top policies. The quote that we have is that, "I'm excited about environmental change, women's rights, and COVID-19 action." And so one of our interviewees mainly focused on the pandemic as one of their voting factors for the presidential election, amongst other candidates as well.
So now moving on to user personas. From our research, we were able to gather three main user personas. So first, we will go through our occasional voter, who is represented by Jessie. So Jessie is our occasional voter here, and she typically registers to vote only every 4 years when she sees that a national election is coming. So Jessie is not interested in local politics, and she does not ever plan on seeking out any information about local politics. Nor is she interested in talking about politics in general. Therefore, she is not one to engage into political conversations within her friends and family. So she doesn't have a strong motive to vote in general. So something you might hear her say is that both candidates kind of suck. So that is Jessie. And moving on, we now have Rahul. So Rahul is the independent thinker, or in other words, he's the most heavily involved in voting and the election process. So a key point for Rahul is that he is split between local and national elections, meaning that he is either very focused on local elections or either primary focuses on national politics, but rarely the both. And then Rahul also sees voting as a very big priority. And so he does, in fact, sees the importance in voting in general. And he's also heavily involved in speaking about politics to his friends and family. So something you might hear him say is, "I do my own research on each candidate." And this would make sense because Rahul typically sees mainstream media to be very, very biased. So he is one to do his own independent research. Yeah, and then lastly, we have Stephen. So Stephen is our mainstream consumer, or in other words, the average voter. So Stephen does see the importance in local politics. However, he is not that involved due to the lack of coverage in the media. And speaking about media, he relies on social media for all of his political news. So something to note is that this can be a little bit problematic because social media tends to have very biased news. And then moving on, he's also moderately interested in politics. So he does refer to his friends and family about creating his political views. And also to note, we wanted to focus our research on Stephen because he best represents the population of surveys and the population of voters that we got from our research. And something you might hear him say is that voting is my civic duty.
So we decided to map out Stephen's voting journey as he is a mainstream consumer and they are our majority in our research. And so Stephen would become interested in the presidential elections, basically when he sees them trending on social media, most likely a few months before the actual election date. And something he might say is everyone's talking about the election on Twitter. Based on what social media is telling him, he might register to vote online. So he could say, I registered to vote on vote.org. In terms of his research, Stephen would mainly rely on mainstream media for research. This includes TV and social media. And so you might say, I like that Biden's policies are being presented on NBC. And Stephen might also discuss with his family and friends about politics to some extent. So that would include him saying, I don't agree with my friends on COVID-19 policies. And then finally, Stephen would go to a polling location to vote. And he would say voting in person was easy, safe, and quick. A few things to note about that is that Stephen would most likely just be politically engaged for this presidential national election. So he would be voting for mainly the national candidates, as well as after this presidential election, he would be not interested um, in the political field too much. As well as the independent thinker and the occasional voter differ from the mainstream consumer in this voting journey because the independent thinker would do a lot more research. So you spend a lot more time doing research in the two research phases, and then the occasional voter might just skip a lot of these steps altogether. So based on our research, we also determined some of Stephen's pain points. So we determined 4 major pain points and then came up with a few how might we questions that we would really fully address in the ideation phase. But the first major pain point is that there's a lack of information on local elections. So how might we question for that is how might we give Stephen the resources to be informed about the candidates and the policies of local elections? The second pain point is that the voting process is inconvenient. So a question for that would be, how might we notify Stephen about the steps in the voting process? The third pain point would be that Stephen and other mainstream consumers do not really understand the impact, direct impact of local elections. So a question for that would be, how might we give Stephen the necessary resources to understand the impact local elections have on him? And finally, the last pain point was that the mainstream media is too biased, but mainstream consumers don't want to take the effort or have the motivation to actually research further and find unbiased media. And so, and how might we question for that would be, how might we present news and information to Stephen in a way that minimizes potential bias? So in terms of next steps, we are ready to start our ideation phase next semester. And so this would mean getting more interviews and survey responses from unrepresented populations. And based on the new research as well as research we conducted this semester, we might generate some more how might we questions based on those pain points. And so one of them could be, how might we make voters ages 18 to 22 more informed about local elections? After that, we would start the prototyping phase. And so we would generate, based on the ideas we generated during ideation, we would start creating some low fidelity and high fidelity prototypes, and then conduct some user testing.
Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but as most data collection goes, it's not perfect. And so a main problem of our data collection with interviews and surveys is that we didn't have a lot of diversity, which I noticed was one of the questions in the Zoom chat. And so we had limited number of interviews as we only interviewed 8 people with around 100 surveys, but the actual voting population of the United States and much less the Texas voting population is a lot bigger than that. So within that, we also focused a lot on Asian Americans, most likely because of the third point, because we only had access or only sought out people that were close contacts with us, whether that was through the surveys or through the people we reach out to interview, which was deeply involved in the surveys. And as you can see from our data, from the survey demographics, the gender ratio was pretty even, which is good, but the ethnicity percentages was where we were very off in terms of having a good diverse representation of the overall voting population and population of Texas and the United States, which is something that we'll need to work on for our next steps as well.
Yeah, so going off of that, to address these sort of concerns, if we were to continue this project in the future, we would certainly seek out interviewees who have more diverse backgrounds. and definitely try to contact people that we don't already know. And definitely reach out to more people to get more responses on the survey, and yeah, just that and more interviews. And other than that, that is it for our presentation. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Can you hear
Go
me?
for it. Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. First of all, great job. I think you uncovered a lot of cool insights. I was wondering if you reached out to some organizations on campus that do a lot of voter engagement and have a lot of data, and have been working in this field for a really long time. I think one of them is called Texas Votes. Did you use any partner organizations?
We actually did interview somebody who was a part of these organizations, but no, we didn't partner with them directly to get any data or anything like that. But that's certainly something we can look into for the future. Thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, because UT Austin is just bustling with civic engagement organizations who've made it their life's mission to increase voter turnout and all that stuff. So I think they can be a great resource for y'all.
Yeah, I agree.
I also have a question. I'm curious about how, and I don't think I fully heard it in the presentation, but maybe it's in your research somewhere, about young people, and the persona, right, is named Steven, or right? Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like, so thinking about Steven, sort of thinking about how might we of like keeping 18 to or engaging more 18 to 22-year-olds. But some of these things, like, I mean, I'm just thinking through the propositions that were on the recent Austin election. Like one of them is this, what's it called? Like Connect Austin or something. And it's like a 15-year, multi-billion-dollar transportation plan. And I'm curious if you're asking questions or trying to understand, like, how do young people feel engaged with something that is happening over such a long period of time? And like, if you've moved to Austin for college, do you feel really connected to Austin as like your hometown where you're like voting in local elections and like you care about your council member? Or is this just like a moment in time? And like, and I was an undergrad, so this is not a judgment on anyone else, but like I lived in West Campus, like my world was like the architecture school to like my co-op and like hanging out with my friends. And I don't know that at the moment I was caring about sort of bigger things, like local, national things, but maybe like the local things, maybe not. So I wonder if there's any research you've had, or my recommendation might be digging deeper in your research in the spring to really understand the motivations that would engage someone in something local and how local 18 to 22-year-olds feel, as opposed to like 50-year-olds who like pay property taxes and like, hate the traffic because they work in Round Rock and, like very different mindset. So
Yeah,
that's kind of
absolutely.
a comment with a question mark on it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That isn't something that we really considered in our research so far. So that would be something to look into in the future. But I do think it's absolutely a great point that like college students might not feel as attached to the city that they're in just because like they only started living there, and they might have hometowns that like they grew up in and they feel more of an attachment to. In terms of the Connect Austin thing, I think that was actually one of the propositions that was like really well funded. I don't think I would know anybody who like hasn't heard of Connect Austin, because like all the ads everywhere, and like the buses have like ads on them and everything. So I certainly think a lot of people would have heard of it, but in terms of whether or not they care because they're college students, that would be something we have to further look into. Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion though. And I think I saw some comments in the chat. How diverse were the group of members that participated in the survey? I think they were reasonably diverse. I have a screenshot here that shows sort of, I don't know, like a small selection of the number of people who responded in the survey. And as you can like kind of judge from like the people like that you can see, like we have a decent selection of like ethnicities and genders and so on. You can also see from these survey demographics these are sort of like we didn't ask like deeper questions about people's backgrounds or stuff like that. So I hope that answers that question.
Sean, I have a question if we still have time.
Yeah, please go for it.
I'm curious to know, I was honestly surprised that Stephen was the most surveyed user persona that y'all found. I thought most people would fall into the first one, the kind of national occasional voter. Do y'all feel like this is truly supported, that Stephen is the most representative of the population? Or do you think that it's possible that some survey bias could have been attributed to that, seeing that if somebody sees a voter engagement survey, people who are more civically engaged are more inclined to take that survey?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Asim, you want to take this question?
Could you repeat the question? My internet cut out for like a few seconds there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was surprised that Stephen was the most surveyed individual and therefore the persona. I thought most people would fall under the first one more. Do you think that this is truly accurate, or do you think that there could be some survey bias accounting for why Stephen was the most surveyed individual?
I think it's a little bit of the mix of the two. I do think there's a little bit of bias in there because yes, people who are generally more civically inclined will fill out the survey or take part in the interviews. But I also do think based on like the data we did collect that we could see that a large portion of them were those mainstream consumers, just based on the way they collected their information when talking to them and the way they viewed the voting process altogether during our interviews.
All right, we have time for one more question if there is
Can I jump
any.
in? Yeah, I'd like to say a few things real fast. Great work, amazing storytelling. There's a lot of other studios in the DFA network who are also working in the voting engagement space. So I encourage you to reach out to them. Happy to connect you afterwards. Your How Can We is amazing. Bouncing off Michael's comment, your specificity is refreshing. It's going to really help you as you just to focus in on that one specific subset and the goal that you're trying to achieve from the very beginning. I can see the focus and the narrow scope is amazing. So great work. I love the storytelling and the range of different personas that you created, like the extreme cases, and then understanding, you know, the general population of young people and how they might engage with politics. I mean, I'm 25 and I can totally relate with that first person of just passive people who don't engage versus very active people who do. So I think like as a young person, it's really reflective of just my lived experience as well. So yeah, great work.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. If you have any other more questions on this project, please put them into the chat. But we will now be moving on to Devna's team, Equity on Campus.